Last time we ended up with the last part of Revelation 7, and we learned that John saw in this vision what was going to be the final events on this earth's history. It was a summary of what was going to happen after the 144,000 were sealed. And we saw that for the righteous, it's going to be a day of deliverance. For the wicked, it's going to be a day of destruction. So this lesson is going to deal with uncovering the meaning of the seven trumpets. And it requires first that we review the history of the Christian church that we studied under the seven churches and the seven seals. Just quickly, we're going to go through that so that we can remind ourselves, refresh our minds about what was going on in the church, because it was what was going on in the church that's the reason why we have the trumpets. But first, we're going to look at what the trumpets mean in the Old Testament, because then that way we can understand why the symbolism of the trumpet was used. So, this lesson is kind of going to be broken down into 4 units: examination of the Old Testament types, brief review of the prophecies so far in Revelation, and then an overview of the history of Rome, and that's where I got stuck with my whittle stick. And then at the end we'll apply all these things. So, quickly, remember that the white horse of the seal, the first seal, related to the Ephesus church. The time frame was 34 or 31 AD, whichever you want to take it from the crucifixion. 34 was the stoning of Stephen, to AD 100, which these are about dates. You can't have an absolute starting date because you don't have an absolute thing that happened to put a pinpoint to it. So we know that John died about AD 100, a little after AD 100, and it was after he died that things really got rolling in a wicked way within the church. Then the red horse symbolized the church under persecution, Roman persecution, pagan Roman persecution, and that lasted until 313, when Constantine passed a law and said, no, we're not going to persecute Christians anymore. We're going to accept the Christians, and I'm going to become a Christian. Then the black horse correlates to the Pergamus church, and that was the church of apostasy. It was under the Pergamus church that these pagan ideas began to be brought in. Instead of being shunned and said, no, that's paganism, we don't want it, they said, oh, well, if it'll make the pagans come and join the church, what does it matter if we do these things? So they allowed things to come into the church that should never have been there. So that was, Pergamos means marriage, and it was during this marriage of the church that paganism was exalted. Remember that? Then that church ended, and we do have a pretty absolute date for that, 538 AD, because it was at that time that the last of the tribes that were in opposition, political opposition, to papal Rome, the rise of papal Rome, was done away with. So 538 is a pretty solid date. We know what happened in that year. So at the beginning of 538, then, is the beginning of the Thyatira church, which is the pale horse the pale horse seal. And we know that from then on, for 1,260 years, the church had control of everything. They had control of politics, they had control of religion, and pale symbolizes that the church was about to die, because the Bible was not available to anybody, and they were fed bad spiritual food, so they were starving themselves to death. They taught for doctrine, the teachings of men, instead of opening their Bibles and studying their Bibles, like we're doing here. During this time, they were doing what Christ himself had condemned. He said, at his time, he was speaking to the Jewish people, of course, but they were teaching their own doctrines. They were perverting the gospel. They were perverting the 10 Commandments and making them hard, especially the Sabbath commandment. There were 663 laws that were concerned the Sabbath commandment. They made the Sabbath a burden to keep. So Christ condemned them, and he said, this people, the Jews, honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Colossians, we find a similar thing where Paul wrote, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men and the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. So what we're trying to do here is follow Christ, not the traditions of men. We're trying to see what the Bible has to say and what history has to say in our understanding of Revelation. We don't want to follow the ideas of men. So the fifth seal was the Church of the Reformation, correlates to Sardis, the Church of Sardis. That church started out okay. They were on fire when they finally realized that the prophecies pointed out that the papacy was the Antichrist. But when those first reformers died, the Reformation kind of died with it, because they again adopted the doctrines of men, and they developed creeds. So we have the creed of the Lutheran Church, and the creed of the Presbyterian Church, and the creed of this church. They didn't follow the Bible. They made man-made creeds, and then that's what they lived on. The sixth seal was a time of the end, and we say that because it led to 1798, which was the end of the prophecy, time prophecy, 1260-year prophecy for the papacy to rule in its power, and because it led to 1844, which was the end of Daniel's 2300-day prophecy. So this was a church of the end. During this time, there was a lot of reformatory work that was taking place in the churches. This was the time of Wesley and Whitfield. They developed a lot of Bible societies. People became more dependent on the Bible and Bible truth. The seventh seal correlates to the cleansing of the sanctuary. It is the time of the Laodicean church, and it's the time of the second coming. It's the time under which we live. It's now that Bible truth will be proclaimed in purity. It's now that people are going to finally understand the everlasting covenant that will prepare them for the second coming. It's now that the righteousness of Christ is finally going to be proclaimed as it was at the day of Pentecost. So the vision that we see here in the trumpets repeats the time frame and the history of the seven churches and the seven seals. So we need to remember what was going on during that time. But the prophecy now focuses on the political world. Wars and that sort of thing. Political change within the government of Rome. And it declares impending judgments against the church, because the church is in apostasy. Now let's look at some of the Old Testament types. And when I did this study, I thought this was really fascinating to go back and look at the Old Testament types in the Old Testament and see when trumpets were used. So we're going to quickly read through these verses here. They're from various places in the Old Testament. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial blowing of the trumpets, a holy convocation. Now, this 7th month was the beginning of the end of their year. The year started with Passover, and it went to the Day of Atonement. The 1st day of the month, they blew the 7th trumpet. All year long, from Passover until the 7th month, at the beginning of every month, they blew a trumpet. The trumpet was to remind the people, judgment's coming. Keep yourselves ready. So the 1st of the month, and the 1st of the month was not like the 1st, of March and the 1st of May, or it was the 1st of the month according to the new moon. When the new moon, not the full moon, they calculated their months and their time according to the new moon. When the new moon came, they blew a trumpet. And the warning was, judgment's coming. The Day of Atonement is coming. When the last month came, they blew a trumpet and they said, judgment's coming in 10 days. Because the Day of Atonement followed 10 days after the blowing of that 7th trumpet. On the Day of Atonement, they also blew a trumpet. Thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then thou shalt cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month in the Day of Atonement. Ye shall make the trumpet sound throughout your land. Now this trumpet was only blown every 49 years on the Day of Jubilee. The Day of Jubilee fell on the Day of Atonement. And that's significant for our